Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If I've not seen you so far this year already, welcome. My name is Deepa Merchandani. I facilitate collaborations within the Catalyst 2030 website. I'm obsessed with the collaborations website. I urge you all to have a look at it. Within the Secretariat, as you would have seen on the collaborations pages of the website, we've been doing a lot of work to showcase member collaborations, but we're also conscious that members have voiced that they wanted a bit of help in navigating what collaborations really are, what collaborating for structural and systemic change really is. And so a couple of months ago, we launched these sessions that are specifically dedicated to collaborations. So welcome. Hopefully that sounds like you're in the right place and where you intended to be. So it's really lovely to see you all. And if you've not met Cynthia, then I'm not sure where you've been, but Cynthia Rayner is a researcher, writer, lecturer. Lucy, if you don't mind turning yourself on mute, that would be ace. Thank you. Researcher, writer, lecturer, affiliated with the Bertha Center for Social Innovation at the University of Cape Town, Graduate School of Business. Her research focuses on how organizations and communities work to shape social systems in collective ways. And she's served in several organizations, including Generation Ubuntu, an after-school program educating children in Cape Town, Mothers to Mothers, an African social enterprise employing women to guide other women to good health, amongst a lot of other activities. And she has a BA from Georgetown, an MBA from INSEAD, and despite pursuing her PhD at the University of Cape Town, actually lives in Austin, Texas. So this is actually really early for Cynthia. So Cynthia, I can't thank you enough. Some of you may have already read the book that Cynthia and Francois wrote together on systems change and learning. And we were having a conversation at the end of last year on how do we apply this for collaborations? How do we make this really practical in action purposes? So we're thrilled to have you here, Cynthia. We are recording this and we're really keen that you all share your experiences. So, but please know that we won't be filming or using your bits. So please share safely and freely. We'll edit Cynthia, her snapshots and pearls of wisdom as they come. But please know that, yeah, your contributions won't be used in any way. We hope that this is a safe and open space for you to share. Have I missed anything? Zoom etiquette is something obviously we talk about. Please be nice to each other, even in the chat and in direct messages. That's it, I think. Cynthia, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Deepa, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation. And I just want to start by saying this is a new conversation for me to think about in the context of systems work, the overlap of systems work and collaboration. So the material that we'll look at largely comes from the book, but I really wanted to foster a conversation amongst this group. This is not me lecturing, me talking to you, rather I think it is us talking together. And I was really looking forward to us being in a much smaller group than what I've had the opportunity to do in the past, so that we can really have that conversation. So this is really exciting. Very glad to be here. As Deepa said, she didn't know that I was in Austin. Many people think I'm still in Cape Town. We moved here in June of this year, so still getting used to these early mornings, and hopefully I can be as coherent as possible at 7:30 a.m. I wanted to start just by reading a quote I was reading this morning, and it struck me that this would be a good way to start. And I'm reading a book called The Dawn of Everything, and it's kind of a relook at history. It's very interesting, and the authors say the ultimate question of human history, as we'll see, is not our equal access to material resources, much though these things are obviously important, but our equal capacity to contribute to decisions about how to live together. We are projects of collective self-creation. So the reason why I thought that really applied to our conversation today is that I think oftentimes we think of collaboration as something quite technical, something that needs to be enabled by perhaps technology or perhaps by tools and frameworks. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what is collaboration? It's us learning how to work together and being creative in the ways we learn to work together. So much of the work of systems work that Francois and I had done up until now was to really look at how organizations operate internally to run programs on behalf of systems change. So much of the collaboration that we were looking at was the collaboration within organizations and then between organizations and the primary actors. Those are the people who are the main beneficiaries. I'm going to use that term, but use it very lightly. Essentially the people who are sitting at the point of greatest complexity and for whom the change is the most impactful. So a lot of our research was around that relationship, the relationship within an organization, and then within an organization to those who the organization is serving. But in collaborations, we're often talking about inter-organizational collaboration. We're talking about collaboration between organizations, and we're also talking about intersectoral collaboration. So often we're talking about collaborations between different types of sectors. So organizations that view the world in fundamentally different ways. So when we think about collaboration amongst organizations, we're still thinking about how do we operate as one. Oftentimes in intersectoral collaboration, we're talking about how do we think together, but understanding that we obviously all think very differently. So I'm going to, so that's just where my mind is thinking about how does systems work apply to that interorganizational collaboration and intersectoral collaboration. What are the lessons that we can take from working within organizations to now expand it to working across organizations and across sectors? And I hope it works, but you can tell me if it doesn't. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put up some slides here, but I am going to take down the slides when we talk together so that we can see each other. Oops. Let me get this. Let me make sure I'm showing the right one. Can everyone see that?
Yep, you did.
Okay, and we did take longer on check-ins, but that's okay. We're going to talk about why and what for collaboration. I'm going to spend just a little bit on this piece, and then I'm going to have you do a short journaling exercise to think about the collaborations that you're involved with, and then we're going to discuss together. And then we're going to talk about what I'm calling getting together and staying together. Essentially, our collaborations at their heart are about people. So if we approach them with a technical mindset only, we miss the very important piece of the fact that we are working together to stay together while we learn together. So a lot of what systems work is about this relational approach to being together and staying together while we're learning. So we're going to see how these case studies and these lessons can apply to our collaborations. And again, I'm going to have you do a short journaling exercise, and then we're going to discuss together. Sometimes I find that journaling can just trigger us and focus our conversation before we get into it together. Okay, so these couple of slides come straight from the book, but they're now looking at them in terms of why would we collaborate? Why would we choose to do this work that we know is very hard, but that we suspect and intuit is very useful. And in the first part of the book, we really try and dissect the social challenges that we face in terms of their complexity, their scale, and their depth. And obviously these things are all interrelated. It's not that we can say, oh, it's complex, but not large scale. It's large scale, but it's not deep. They're all these things all at once. And it's the reason why we choose these three features are one of the main reasons why we choose to collaborate when we want to solve these social issues. So what do we mean by complexity? I think we talk about complexity a lot, but oftentimes we don't really dissect it into the things that it really means for us, and why these things would really mean that we would need to collaborate. So when things are complex, they're relationship based. In fact, it's not just the pieces that create the complexity, it's the interrelationships between the pieces. So you can't isolate the parts. And I think we all really understand that intuitively in our work, that you can't take one piece out, but oftentimes we think that we can. So we're built, we're not built, we're taught in school to kind of dissect things and analyze them in pieces and then put them back together. Well, in complex systems, that doesn't work. We have to analyze them in their full complexity. And that means we have to analyze the relationships too. The second one is a major reason why collaboration is hard. There's no single formulation of the problem. And I think many of you have probably experienced that when you've gone into your initial collaborations, is being exposed to the fact that other people are seeing the problem in a totally different way than what you see it as. And so this creates lots of disagreement. I think reframing this to the fact that that disagreement is healthy and important, and in fact, something that we want to encourage and foster, is a real mindset shift, and something that we have to do if we're going to do collaboration in such a way that we really get the benefit of everybody's points of views. There's no end point. So we can set North Stars as much as we like. North Stars are important. They allow us to align. But what we must realize is that there's a whole universe beyond that North Star. So we will find ourselves getting closer to the North Star and finding that we are still disagreeing. We will find that we are still seeing the problem in new ways because we're seeing beyond the North Star, all of us. And of course, we're going to see them in different ways because it's a complex issue. Unique situations and contexts, that's what we all bring. The plural nature of a collaboration is the beauty of it, but it also means that everybody's coming from a context that is different. And our solutions are not true or false. I think this is a really important one that can be really utilized in a collaborations outset when we're first starting to get together, is not look at a solution as that is the true one solution or the false bad solution, but rather there are good solutions, and then there are solutions that are not so good, and we have to weed through them to find the ones that are good. Moving on to scale, and this is one of those words that has become a dogma in our sector. Everything has to be built to scale, and what I'd like us to do is kind of step back and say why. Why do we need to scale? What is the impetus for that scale? And our desire to scale comes from a very important desire, which is to see problems solved across bigger and more widespread geographies and populations. But knowing that the wicked problems that we need to solve have no stopping point, scale also gives us an opportunity to learn more. So rather than thinking of scale as something that we must do, let's think of scale as something that offers opportunities, but also challenges. It's not a matter of cookie cutter replication. There is a lot to learn when scale happens, and it's not things that we can always predict. So two different types of scale, and I think this is important to think about in your collaborations. What type of scale are you talking about when you're talking about scale? Even when in a collaboration, when somebody might say, well, we need to ensure that we're fit for scale, you want to look at what is the scale that we're actually trying to achieve. In our industry, oftentimes scale is referred to as efficiency. It's putting higher impact, increasing your throughput in a system. So this is the factory model of social change. This is when we say, okay, because we've got something that works in one geography, we can simply replicate it and put it through the system at a higher rate and achieve the same impacts. Unfortunately, oftentimes in social systems, it doesn't work like a factory. There are examples of things that can work in those ways. Vaccines, in some cases, can be that. In that case, that's one example. So some measures can be replicated with increasing throughput in a system, but oftentimes in social systems, they behave in different ways when we change the size of them. So we have to be really careful when we look at scale, not to think that they're going to behave in the same way. And then lastly, what do we mean by depth? I think this is the one that has become most revealing to us over the course of the last couple of years in particular, as we have dealt with the repercussions of our common history as well as our individual histories, and really thinking about how depth is impacted by our attempts to make social change. And again, let's come back to the fact that the systems that we seek to change are made up of people, and we are those people. So when we try to change systems, we are trying to change ourselves. We're not like scientists in a lab trying to manipulate variables outside of ourselves. We cannot imagine change if we ourselves are sitting within the structures in which we are trying to change. And so that ability to kind of step back and to work as a team to be able to see all the different aspects of the systems we seek to change is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, we are often the very people who maintain and extend the systems of oppression that are already in place. Last slide, and then I'm going to have you do a little bit of thinking on your own and then together. I wanted to put this up as kind of the what of collaboration. And this would be the what of collaboration that I would put forward based on the research we did with systems work. And it makes the distinction between what we can do as just an organization or as an individual and what we can do in a collaborative environment. But what collaboration does seek is something quite difficult, which is the outputs of shared understanding, shared purpose, shared resources, shared power, and shared experience. So a significant number of sharing opportunities. And the outcome that we seek is that the collaboration is more than the sum of its parts. So just as a system operates in such a way that the relationships create more than the sum of their parts, a collaboration is a system in and of itself. We're creating these collaborative systems that are more than the sum of their parts. In many cases, I think we'll talk about a collaboration when we're doing something that's just an exchange. So if you have an exchange of information or an exchange of resources or even an exchange of experience with an individual or with an organization, that's a very valuable experience and something we certainly want to encourage. But that's, I would say that's not a collaboration. Essentially, we only get to the point of collaboration when we're actually more than the sum of our parts. And so all of the whys that we've gone through up until now, the complexity, the large scale nature of social challenges, as well as the depth of those social challenges, requires us to be more than the sum of our parts when we operate together. And if we're simply looking for exchange, if we're simply looking to get more for the one, rather than actually contribute and become more together, then we're not really in a collaboration. We're in an exchange, we're in a transaction. So this transaction versus collaboration, I think, is an important thing for us to think about as a group, because if Catalyst is going to truly inspire collaborations that operate in acceleration of the SDGs, these collaborations have to be more than the sum of their parts. That's the value we seek to bring. Okay, so I've just kind of gone through quite a lot, but I think that it's important for us to think about it in our individual brains before we share together. So I want you to look at this slide and I want you to just spend, I'm going to say 3 minutes, thinking about the collaboration that you're currently involved with. And it can be the Catalyst collaboration, or it can be another one that you want to work with. And I want you to rate from 1 to 5, 1 being none that is shared, and 5 being, yeah, we're totally sharing these things. I want you to rate on these 5 levels how this collaboration is doing. So shared understanding, shared purpose, shared resources, shared power, and shared experience. And then at the end, I would like you to just write a couple of sentences about how the collaboration is more than the sum of its parts, if you think that it is. If it's not, then let's talk about that as well. So I'm just going to set my timer here, and I'm going to give 3 minutes of quiet while you journal on those aspects of collaboration. And we're going to start talking about the how. So really what we've just done is the why and the what, very briefly on what. But now thinking about how do we collaborate? And here's where I'm going to bring in the framework of systems work, and we'll see if it's useful. Essentially, systems work, as I've described, is more of the relational side of systems building, systems changing, rather than what I would call the technical side. We know more about the technical side of systems. We're often encouraged to map systems, to analyze systems, to figure out the flow of resources, leverage points. Many of these terms are probably familiar to you. And systems thinking is a way of seeing all of systems in their entirety. But when Francois and I were doing our research on organizations working on systems change, what we saw far more importantly, but hidden beneath the surface, was a lot of work on relationships. So what is relational work? Relational work is the work of creating relationships. And much of the effort and organizing activity in the organizations we studied were these three principles. And these principles associate with practices, but I'm not going to get that deep into it today, although the book goes into much more detail on all of the practices. We're actually going to look even at the tactical level today, because I think that might be more useful for us. So what is the purpose of systems work? It's to build responsive and representative systems. So again, this is the relational aspect of systems. How can they evolve to meet the needs of the people who live in them? Not scientists in the lab trying to manipulate variables, but rather living in systems. How do we make them respond to the changing environment? And how do we make them representative of the people who live in them? So the three principles that we saw in these organizations, the first of which is foster connection. The second of which is embrace context. And the third is reconfiguration of power. And what I'd like to propose is that our work in collaborations is also the same, is to do these three things. And they're not linear, so you don't foster connection, then embrace context, then reconfigure power. You're doing these three things all the time. And many of the activities that you find that I think that you probably are already doing in collaborations are associated with these three things, but maybe you're not already calling them as such. And that's what I'd really love to talk about. So a really key question for us in systems work is who should drive the change? And as collaborators, oftentimes you're driving change in order to benefit organizations or issues in which you have a passion or an interest, and those often serve communities. But oftentimes I think in collaborations, the primary actors are these individuals and groups which are truly benefiting from the collaboration, or at least that's what I think we should be working on collaboration towards. But oftentimes we forget the primary actors. Oftentimes we don't include these primary actors as the actual members of the collaboration. So in the organizations that we studied doing systems work, primary actors were actually the center of the change. And these were the individuals and groups living at the point of greatest complexity in a system. So I'd like you to think, as we're walking through this, who are the primary actors in my collaboration? Who are the primary actors who need to be involved, who need to be part of? And these, it doesn't have to be what I would call grassroots. It just has to be those who can see and be part of the greatest complexity in a system. So what's an example of that? An example, I think, is how Catalyst is currently moving much of its energy towards its country membership. The realization that country members and country social entrepreneurs who are at the point of greatest complexity in a system are where the energy of the broader collaboration of Catalyst should go is a very interesting, I think, move towards primary actors being at the center of the activity. And we can talk about whether that's the case, but that's what I'm seeing right now, and I think it's a very exciting move for Catalyst. Okay, so what does it mean to foster connection? We've defined fostering connection as building collective identity to stay together while learning. And many of you have already mentioned things that sound to me very much like fostering of connection. Winthrop, when you described those activities of building shared purpose, shared understanding, these are the activities that build collective identity. But oftentimes we skip over this part. We just go straight to, okay, what are we going to do together? What are we going to do? But the reason why people stay together is not because they want to do things together. It's often because of the way they feel when they are doing things together. Valeria, I heard that coming through as well. Friendships, the way we actually interrelate with one another, the sense of common identity that we get when we continue to stay together over a long period of time. Winthrop, you mentioned that it was 2 years together. That's a long time. You have to like the people that you're working with in order to make that happen. So one of the case studies that we had in the book is Mothers to Mothers, an organization that I spent quite a long time with. And Mothers to Mothers is an interesting organization. And we really focused in the book on the relationship between moms in Mothers to Mothers. So the relationship between a mother who had already given birth and had gone through the process of preventing mother-to-child transmission of HIV, who is now in conversation with a new pregnant mother who is now going to go through the process herself. And that relationship becomes a really key part of ensuring that that new mom can go through this process successfully. But what I realized when I was putting this together is that actually one of the greatest successes of Mothers to Mothers is not just that really important relationship, but also the very important relationship that they have built between the organization of Mothers to Mothers and the broader health system in which they operate. So they actually integrate directly into clinics. They situate their mothers, their mentor mothers, inside clinics. And much of the effort of the organization is to collaborate with health systems throughout 10 countries in Africa to ensure that those health workers, mothers living with HIV, can situate themselves very effectively within a health system that is not built to accept that woman as a health worker in the system. So they actually have to fundamentally change the relationship between the mother, the new mentor mother, and the health system in order to make that relationship between the mom and the mom work very well. And so how do they do that? I'm not going to go through this in huge detail, but what I want to just point out here is that many of the things that we're talking about in collaboration, the things that really make a collaboration tick, are not happening at the surface level. So when you're talking about your collaboration, when you're thinking about your collaboration, oftentimes you're talking about what I call surface work. It's the work that you are doing within the outside world so that people understand why the collaboration exists. But much of the work to make the collaboration work actually happens beneath the surface. So there are things that are happening beneath the surface that you are doing very intentionally to make that collaboration continue, which actually is not the work that is representative to the outside world. And it is okay to spend an enormous amount of energy and effort on those underground things, because those are actually what makes the work on the surface operate in a smooth and effective fashion. So what does Mothers to Mothers do? They're doing these specific tactics, and I want to kind of push your eye towards those tactics there. They're doing things such as shifting stigma to pride. They're ensuring that the stigmatized identity of a mother living with HIV is now one of pride amongst that group. Interestingly enough, within Catalyst, there's an interesting kind of loneliness of social entrepreneurship that is now being addressed by moving that to a point of pride. I'm a social entrepreneur and I know how to solve problems. And in fact, I wouldn't call social entrepreneurs a stigmatized identity, but there is definitely a shift to pride in Catalyst, which people definitely rally around. Hosting of safe havens is a really important piece. Winthrop, when you describe these calls that you're having on a weekly basis, these are very time-consuming activities, but it is very much the act of creating a we and creating a collective identity that you guys are working on in those meetings. And then pooling of experiences. Oftentimes we think that just talking about our experiences is a luxury. Maybe it's something that we're feeling like it's a waste of time. But actually that sharing of personal experiences and how we got to where we are today, and then experiencing together what those feel like, is a true part of crafting the collective identity of a group. So that those water cooler chats, the things that you're doing in a Zoom room in order to just start the conversation, those are extremely critical and important pieces of creating a collective identity. So these are the tactics that we discovered were happening in many of these organizations. The building of a we, so that's the collective identity. Shifting stigma to pride. So in many cases, looking at something that, oh, I don't know if this is really who I am. Is this something that I want to become? Now shifting it to a point of pride. Hosting havens, and these can be virtual, these can be physical, they can be, even in the case of Mothers to Mothers, it's a small closet sometimes in a clinic. In the case of Birthsorg, which is a health organization, they have kind of team centers and oftentimes they're virtual. But these hosting of havens is a really important activity. and then the pooling of experiences, both on a professional and a personal level, that allow you to really get to know one another and build the collective identity as a whole. So just want to quickly open it up here and ask one person to share about their experience of creating collective identity in a collaborative. Just one sharing moment. Would anyone like to do that? There we go. I want to talk about the second principle of embracing context. And this is a really exciting one that was not something that we thought we would find when we were doing the research. This idea that a plurality of solutions is actually what you're going for, not a single solution. And, you know, we had been schooled in a business school, again, kind of efficiency mindset, get to the best solution, find the evidence, and then scale, scale, scale. And what we realized was that in the organizations that were truly having an impact at a systemic level, oftentimes those organizations doing that kind of silver bullet approach, cookie cutter approach, were very effective in a very in a certain context. But then as they tried to grow, it became harder and harder. And what we saw that organizations that were working at a systemic level, they had to actually start embracing a plurality of solutions. Now, how did they do this? This is what is most interesting to my mind about doing this plural work, is that I'll talk about an organization called Family Independence Initiative. Family Independence Initiative is an organization that works with families who are living in poverty to actually create groups of self-help groups, I'll call them. And they call them mutual aid groups, but essentially groups that get together and journal and share information on how to lift themselves out of poverty. The organization of FII does not help. They do not provide solutions. They do not provide any sort of assistance except to give a computer and to help form the group. The group members identify themselves, and then FII supports the group. And then they give some sort of financial contribution as the goals are met, but only as matching contributions. And FII will say, we are not a helping organization. We are not a social service organization. We're an upliftment organization. And how do they do this? Well, I would say that their surface work is this peer groups for families lifting themselves out of poverty. But essentially what they are is a data circulation organization. They are circulating the data through the group, ensuring that everybody can see what others are doing so that they can learn and pick up the things that work best for them. And many times collaborations are that same actor. They are responsible for ensuring that organizations that come into a collective or members that come into a collective are able to see across the collective and pick up what works for them. But oftentimes it's very hard to see. So doing that sort of collaborative work where you allow members to be able to see the work of others and use it in your own context becomes a really important piece of collaborative work, but it's very difficult to do. And that's why collaboratives often form in order to do that. The other thing they do is decentralized decision-making. So decision-making does not happen at this kind of higher level. This is the model we're going to do, and we're going to scale, scale, scale. Rather, it becomes that the decision-making is very much in the grassroots efforts. So what are some of the tactics that we saw here? This circulating data is a very big one. Sometimes this is done technologically. Sometimes it's done person to person. There's an organization that we'll talk about next that does it with horizontal exchanges, and they are people actually visiting other people to learn from their activities. Decentralizing decision-making, meaning that top-down solutions don't work. The decision makers are those who pick up the solutions and run with them in their context. Positioning problem solvers, this simply means that there need to be people that can assist and can go alongside the learning and ensure that that learning is being picked up and that motivation is sustained, which is this last one. So how do you create that sustained motivation? I can see this in Catalyst. There's a lot of effort that goes into sustaining the motivation of the network so that we can learn from each other. And that is true work. Sometimes we think of that as being kind of just rah cheerleading, but in fact, that sustaining of motivation is an extremely important aspect of collaboratives that we sometimes overlook. So I'm just going to stop here, and I want to see if there's anyone who would like to share about a collaborative that they're involved with where information sharing and a plurality of solutions is a big piece to it. Can you share about how that works? It's the one that this principle of reconfiguring power was the one that we felt was probably the most difficult to enact in life, because many of the collaborations, well, let me say many of the organizations that we studied, and by extension, the collaborations that we're talking about today, come with pre-existing power configurations that already exist in the outside world. So many of you are obviously working with collaborations where you're bringing in government, private sector, funders, all of which bring different power dynamics into the room. And I would suspect, or I would propose that the two that come before this, the two that we've talked about before this, of fostering a connection and embracing context, lay the groundwork for this reconfiguration of power to happen. But if we see our collaborations as trying to create new power configurations that can then exist in the outside world, we can have an intentionality about our collaborations that we might not have otherwise. So let me say that in a different way. If we replicate the power configurations of the outside world within the collaborations that we're building, we will only reinforce those power configurations outside. And I do believe that it is strongly our job as collaborators within the social change space to actually change those power configurations within our collaborations so that they can look differently to the outside world as well. And so how? That's so much easier to do than to say, or to say than to do. So this picture is a bit fuzzy, I'm sorry, because it's a great photo. But the organization here that we studied was Slum Dwellers International. And Slum Dwellers International is quite an old organization. They consist of self-help groups and slum associations from around the world. They're operating in over 500 cities. They link more than 1 million slum residents around the world together. And one of their big activities, their surface work, is doing these horizontal exchanges. So they will send groups of slum dwellers from one geographic location to another city to learn from one another on how they are advocating for upliftment schemes rather than eradication of slums. Often they will learn activist activities, they'll learn savings group activities. Essentially, they'll share their experiences and how they've managed to transform their communities with one another. And again, like I said, in the embracing context, kind of lifting up these ideas and transplanting them, but only with a lot of contextualization. And the point I want to make here is that the way SDI has operated is that they truly believe that experts have no place in this movement. So experts can be brought in by the governance structures themselves to help, but they cannot become the leadership of the organization. The organization is led by slum dwellers themselves in their efforts to transform their own communities. And what I want to point out here is that it is very messy. So there is a lot of this horizontal organizing, which means that people are going to other places and they're accessing funding from maybe the central repository in order to go and make a horizontal exchange with another group. But also they're doing a lot of this kind of structuring of governance within cities, first within their own slum communities, then within the cities, then within a national organization, and then up to a broader secretariat. And it is a very time-consuming, very messy, very chaotic process, which actually does work. So this was the thing that really blew my mind, was that all of this activity that seemed like it was just really confusing to an outsider was actually having a significant impact on those slum dwellers and how they were able to imagine, reconceptualize, and then rebuild their own communities. And how did they do this? The first is those horizontal exchanges, those linking the groups together. And like I said, in some cases, organizations are doing this virtually. Certainly during COVID, that has proliferated. But in the case of SDI, much of that happens physically. So I'll get on a plane or I'll get on a bus and I'll go and I'll visit another group. The second is observing rituals. And this is fascinating to me because I see this happening now so clearly in collaboratives, but I wouldn't have seen it otherwise. This idea that when we come together, we have these rituals that keep us together. And in the case of SDI, their ritual is around data collection. So they have a very specific way that they teach different groups within slums to go door to door and to gather the data of the families who are living in their communities. And this becomes an almost a ritualistic effort across. So if you meet another group, you'll tell the stories of your data collection because there are so many powerful stories across the network, and those stories become the currency that they use when they're meeting with one another. The third is that encouraging collaboration with flexibility. So they don't have any kind of, oh, this is how you're going to go and do your horizontal exchange. They say what the purpose is and they give funding for people to go and do their horizontal exchange. But ultimately, it's up to the group to decide how to use that information and how to keep in contact with one another. And then this last one, moving from outrageous to acceptable. I think I got this one from Giroux, I'm not going to lie. This is the idea that you put something very outrageous out in the world and that you take the very small steps to get to these to this outrageous together. So oftentimes it's that outrageous idea that becomes a mobilizing North Star for the group, and getting there in small incremental steps. What do they say? How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Making that effort over a longer period of time together. So those are the tactics on reconfiguring power. It says promoting platforms here. There's another set of practices around policies and advocacy, which I'm not going to do today, but which are also in the book and also relate to power. I don't think it's quite as relevant for today's conversation, but this is really the platform of power as opposed to the policies of power. So I'm going to just stop here, and we've probably got just about, 8 minutes together. I was going to do a final journaling exercise, but rather than take some of our conversation time to do it, I'll put it up at the very end and you can take a snapshot if you would like to do it for yourself.
Thank you so much. And just to also say that we will post a video of an edited version of this onto the resources pages of the site. And also, just to plug Winthrop, because he's in the room, Winthrop's conversation with Rana Dajani, who is collaborator extraordinaire, and their conversation on collaborations we'll pop that on the resources pages of the website as well. So that will go up early next week.
Thank you, Deepa. Yeah, and one's coming out with Cynthia and Francois in another week.
There you go.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend ahead.
Thank you.